Good evening and welcome to our Ad Hoc Budget Advisory Committee meeting. We are not going into close this evening, so I will read the recommendation that Council convenes in open session at 5 p.m. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favour? And that's passed. We'll be doing the moment of reflection in regular council this evening. And our land acknowledgement, I will turn it over to Councillor Wilkinson, please.
We've gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant in the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community.
Thank you. We have no additions to the agenda, so the recommendation is that the agenda as presented for February 13th, 2023 be adopted. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. All of those in favour? And that carries. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, I will move along to the previous minutes, and the recommendation is that the minutes for the following meeting be adopted as presented. The minutes for January 30th, 2023. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favour? And that carries. This evening, we do not have any public meetings, presentations, or consent agenda items, so we will jump right into the report, which is the 2023 base operating budget draft. We're going to get it on the floor, and then we will bring up Mr. Kelly to present. So may I please have a mover to get this on the floor? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. And I will now turn it over to Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer Patrick Kelly to introduce the report. Sorry, actually, I'm going to turn it over to CAO Chambers first, who would like to just make a few remarks.
Yes. Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. This evening, staff will be presenting the first draft of the 2023 operating budget for Council's consideration and discussion purposes. At the first ad hoc budget committee meeting held on December 12th, staff brought forward a report recommending that the draft operating budget be prepared based on an inflationary levy increase of 4.8%. In addition to that, staff asked Council to approve a dedicated infrastructure levy adjustment of 2.8%, and that's as it is outlined in the Township's asset management plan, which was updated and approved by Council in 2022. A placeholder of 2% for proposed increases to levels of service was also suggested. However, Council referred the matter back to staff for more information. It's been a long-standing practice to set the target levy increase at the beginning of the budget process, with staff largely being responsible for crafting the budget within those parameters. The historical approach has been to align the levy increase with inflation based on core CPI or less. One of the issues with this approach is that it doesn't take into consideration other pressures that the Township may be facing that are not directly related to inflation. And for Wilmot, these non-inflationary budget pressures include continued reduction in provincial funding, increased operational requirements and workload to comply with new and existing legislation and safety standards and provincial policy. We know that Bill 23 and Bill 39, we just don't know the full effect of those legislative changes, and yet they will be impacting us in this year. We've had minimal increase in new assessment resulting from a period of low growth, with only $37,000 coming from growth-related revenues this year. Lower levels of industrial and commercial assessment as compared to some neighboring townships. We're now seeing annual repayment requirements for taking on debt at a time when interest rates are high. Extremely high costs of materials, supplies, and labor impacting project costs in a post-COVID environment. We're preparing for growth, And that means that we're dealing with an increased workload to prepare for growth, but we haven't realized those revenues yet. And the annualization of new staffing costs that were approved in previous budget years, we're seeing that as a pressure in this year. So the budget presentation contains some key statistics showing the township's position in relation to municipal comparators pertaining to taxation and user fees, revenues, and reserve funds. This could be an indicator that the historical approach of establishing tax rate increases based on inflation or less may be now impacting our financial circumstances. Director Kelly will speak to this in more detail during the budget presentation. The draft budget is based on maintaining existing levels of service and maintaining the historical annual levy-funded transfer of approximately $1.4 million to the capital program, and that includes a 4.8 inflationary adjustment to that transfer. Additional resources for increased levels of service are not included in this draft budget. With Council coming fresh off the campaign trail, we understand that you may have heard from citizens that there's a desire for new and expanded services in the areas of economic development, enhanced citizen engagement, seniors programming, and much more. The timing of an election in October immediately in advance of the annual budget process is challenging, and even more challenging when you have 100% turnover of members of Council. Council hasn't had an opportunity yet to set your priorities for the term. The 2023 capital budget will include a proposal to update the township's strategic plan. If approved, this will include a robust engagement with residents and businesses and will ensure that the township is focusing our resources towards programs and services that meet the needs of the community while we are preparing for future growth. In 2024, I'm committed to work with the corporate leadership team to update the township's budget process to ensure that the budget is tied to the strategic plan and to provide greater detail on program and service delivery planning. As I previously stated, we are not asking Council to approve the operating budget tonight. At the next budget meeting on February 21st, staff will present the proposed 2023 capital budget. The capital budget and operating budget are interconnected and should not be considered in isolation, and it's important for Council to see the big picture before making decisions. So where are we now? The levy impact of this first draft of the operating budget is currently sitting at an increase of 8.89%, excluding the dedicated infrastructure levy of 2.8% and any new levels of service. Past practice would have been for staff to have this referred back to staff and for staff to make the adjustments to achieve a council-approved target. But this removes council from the decision-making process, and it really is within council's purview to decide upon the programs and services that are provided to the community. So we see this as a starting point for council tonight. We're committed to working with council to adjust the budget to an inflationary target that's acceptable to you and the community and reflect your priorities for the year. Tonight, we invite you to ask us questions of clarification and provide direction to staff on budget areas where you may want further information and analysis. And staff is here, and we're happy to provide answers for you. They're all ready to be on the hot seat, so fire away. And with that, I will turn it over to the Director of Corporate Services, Patrick Kelly, to begin the budget presentation.
Thank you, CAO Chambers, and through you, Mayor Salonen. As noted by Sharon several times in that presentation, or in those opening comments, tonight's about providing information to committee. We heard from committee loud and clear in the first meeting that additional information was required prior to providing any direction or decisions. The reports we put forward tonight were put together in an effort to provide additional detail and context as you enter the budget process. My comments at the outset of tonight's discussion will focus predominantly on the top-level operating budget summary slide, which is an attachment within this report. But prior to that, I did want to review the results from our environmental scan, which is presented on page 21 of your report, and I have the slide available. If Deputy Clerk Curtis could pull that up, I'll speak to it. This slide provides statistical information from our regional peers and provincial counterparts in terms of both fiscal circumstances and affordability. So rather than let Council and the community decipher what these statistics mean, I thought I'd just take a moment to explain them. So the first three statistics, or the first two, I guess, would have to do with how Wilmot Township compares from a property tax standpoint versus other municipalities across the region and across the province. The first stat on there is the average property taxes in 2021 for a two-story home. As you can see, Wilmot Township is well below that of our peers within the region and also below the survey average across the entire province of Ontario. Sometimes looking at that stat is difficult because it is specifically for a two-story home, and there's lots of different property types within the township. So we do like to also look at the stat of what the net levy is per $100,000 of assessment on a property. In Wilmot Township in 2021, per $100,000 of weighted assessment, our ratepayers would pay $755 versus across the province of Ontario, they would pay approximately $1,051. Those two specifically speak to where the levy sits in Wilmot Township. The next stat is unpaid taxes as a percentage of taxes levied at year end. So this specifically is how much we have sitting owing from property taxpayers in Wilmot Township at the end of the fiscal year versus what we billed out. That number is on the very low end of municipalities across this entire province. 2.5% of outstanding taxes at year end is almost unheard of in municipalities across Ontario. It speaks to the fiscal circumstances and affordability for residents within Wilmot Township, albeit not all residents or businesses, but at the high level, 2.5% is well below what we see across the province. Another piece, stat that I included in there is own source revenues as a percentage of our total expenditures. I've spoken at previous council meetings and budget meetings on own source revenues. Essentially, this is revenues that we raise within Wilmot Township from Wilmot Township, so taxes and user fees. Wilmot Township, as you can see, 78% of our total spending in a year is covered through our own source revenues, meaning we rely on external sources like grant funding programs for 22% of our annual spending. If you look at our peers across the region and the province, both are over 90%. And then the last piece that we wanted to provide was dealing with reserve funds. It's spoken to in the report. This is directly a result of historic practices in Wilmot Township of funding capital initiatives through existing reserve funds rather than issuing debentures or debt to fund those capital purchases over the long term. As you can see, our reserve funds as a percentage of our own source revenues are around 14% in Wilmot Township, while the average across the province is 72.5%. The last one is a stat that we are not proud of in Wilmot Township. $82 per capita is what we have sitting in reserve funds. So for every person in Wilmot Township, there's $82 sitting in reserve funds for future infrastructure. That is, if you look at the BMA study statistics, the lowest number across the entire participants within that list. So staff felt it was appropriate before we entered the operating budget discussions to provide context of where Wilmot sits. We feel that it's important that council has that information when we look to what we're projecting or draft operating budget needs are. So if you can go to the next slide, Chad. So this is the high level. You probably won't see it well in chambers, but you have copies of it in front of you, and online viewers will see it better. So beginning in the revenue section, excluding any additional levy adjustments beyond
Excuse me, sorry, could you tell us what page we can find that
Sure.
on? I'm just trying to follow along with you. Thank you.
Yep, page 22 of the entire package. 4 of 37 and page 22 of the entire PDF. Thank you, Councillor Martin. Beginning in the revenue section, Excluding any additional levy adjustments beyond what was already approved under the dedicated infrastructure levy, we're projecting $24.7 million in revenues in 2023. The revenues are broken down into distinct categories for property taxes, general operating revenues, external grant funding, investment income, and then contributions from development charges and user pay. So if you'll allow me, I'll just dive into a little more detail of what makes up each of those lines. Property taxes are budgeted in three distinct buckets. The general levy is the total property tax funding that you as council approve for a fiscal year, inclusive of that assessment growth that was spoken to by CAO Chambers. This general levy is proportionately billed to property owners based on existing tax legislation from the province, ratios from the Upper Tier Region of Waterloo, and assessment values from MPAC. As council is aware from your recent attendance at the Roma conference and from your reading that you do on a regular basis, assessment values have not been updated since 2016. However, I want to take the opportunity to share this information with council and the community that the updating of assessment values and a reassessment by MPAC will not generate more funding for the Township of Wilmot. A reassessment cycle merely changes the distribution of taxes across the existing tax base. So the amount that each individual property owner and assessment class are responsible for, it's a redistribution of taxes. It is not new funding to the municipality. Staff continue to monitor information from the ministry regarding when this potential assessment update will occur, but we have no additional details to report to council at this time. The projected general levy that you see there, excluding any additional adjustments beyond the infrastructure levy, is sitting at $10.2 million. The second bucket of property tax funding is smaller with regards to payment in lieu of taxes. So properties belonging to senior levels of government are exempt from taxation under the Assessment Act in accordance with Section 125 of our Constitution. However, for many years, the federal government and the province have granted funds to municipalities in lieu of property tax payments. Generally, they're the equivalent to the amount of taxes that would have been payable were the property not exempt from taxes. The draft budget is projecting roughly $206,000 in PILs for Wilmot. The final, very small component of our taxes has to do with supplementary taxes, net of write-offs. Supplementary taxes are a new assessment that comes in mid-year, comes on stream midway through the year, and we send out supplementary tax bills to property owners in the municipality. They weren't picked up in the roll at the start of the year, so they weren't included within the budget. In high growth areas, supplementary taxes can represent a significant amount of funding. In low growth areas, such as what Wilmot Township has experienced in the last few years, supplementary taxes are very minimal, $65,000. All combined, our own source revenues from the property tax system is projected at $10.5 million in 2023. That's inclusive of the dedicated infrastructure levy at 2.8% and the minimal assessment growth of 0.38%. The next component of revenues is operating revenues generated through user fees as committee endorsed under the Township's updated fees and charges bylaw. As noted within the Recover report, user fees, particularly at the Wilmot Recreation Complex, community centres and parks, are anticipated to rebound back to pre-COVID levels for fiscal 2023. In addition to this, staff are projecting increases on fees within the engineering and infrastructure services area in an approach to recover costs more effectively for development-related items and charges as growth begins to ramp up in the Township in 2023 and 2024. Overall operating revenues are set to increase to $10.8 million in 2023, which will assist, as noted in the report, in offsetting funding that we're no longer receiving through COVID relief programs. All of those revenues, that's a high level at 10.8. They're in greater detail, more granular detail within the department budgets. A big impact on this year's budget has to do with external grant funding, which dramatically reduces in 2023. This is due to the elimination of COVID relief funding, as previously mentioned, as well as the continued clawback of funding through the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund. The overall reduction of $563,000 in external grant funding would be the equivalent of a 5.7% tax increase in the absence of any of those increased operating revenues that I just spoke of. Staff and council continue to lobby peers at the province to provide further review into the impacts of OMPF funding reductions, especially on rural farming communities such as Wilmot Township. Moving in the opposite direction of that grant funding is the township's anticipated investment income. As everyone's seen, higher yields in money markets are generating additional returns on existing funds held within the township's general account and unspent funds within the capital program. Having said that, I want to be clear that this would become a revenue risk in future years when we start to outlay large sums of capital funding and when yields go back to what I would call normal levels on money markets. In addition to this, staff are projecting improved returns from the township's investment in the new Innova Power Corp. Improved returns are what I would consider a more sustainable funding mechanism. We're seeing anticipated increases in returns as part of the merged entity moving forward into 2024. The last two pieces of our revenue structure are contribution from development charges. This is a new line within the top level report. This specifically refers to the amount of debt payments that are funded through development charges for growth-related capital expenditures at $470,000. And finally, revenues include our net contribution from user pay divisions, which are projected at $1.27 million. Township's three main user pay divisions are the water and sanitary utility, the building services department, and cemetery services, each of which utilize services from levy-funded departments, and a corresponding contribution from user fees is made to cover the cost for those services. Staff have noted within the report that the formula used to calculate this allocation is now nearing 5 years old, and we're looking to review that formula as part of the 2023 work program to update it heading into 2024. So that is a summary of the $24.7 million in revenues that you see in front of you. I'll jump into expenditures quickly before opening it up to committee for questions. So overall expenditures are split into four main buckets. Our operating expenditures are transferred to the capital program, transferred infrastructure reserve funds, and are now our new long-term debt payment. So 2023 operating expenditures across all service areas, levy-funded and user pay divisions, is projected to reach $21.6 million in 2023. A number of factors are driving the year-over-year budget increase and have been outlined within the cover report and the detail that follows this summary slide. Most notably, inflationary pressures on commodity costs and contracted services are generating approximately $420,000 in new costs for 2023. This alone would be the equivalent of a nearly 5% tax increase in the absence of increased operating revenues. Some other driving factors within the report are COLA adjustment and grid movement for existing staff, the annualization of staffing costs onboarded in 2022, and increased part-time staffing requirements to service demand at community centers and meet legislative requirements within our infrastructure services division. The combined impact of full-time and part-time staffing costs, excluding any increases in service levels, is projected at $611,000 within the draft budget. On top of the $611,000 is mandatory employment-related costs, or MERCs, of roughly $145,000. The final significant driving factor within the operating expense increase is insurance and legal fees. The combination of both are projected to increase by roughly $438,000 in 2023. As noted by CAO Chambers, the Township's capital program will be presented at our meeting next week. The program is predicated on a number of funding sources. One that we hold dearly is the transfer to the capital program from current year levy dollars. We structure that based on an annual inflationary adjustment to ensure that current year taxes are funding a portion of the capital program. For 2023, that's projected at $1.43 million. The transfer to infrastructure reserve funds are sitting at a projection of $1.84 million. This increase is attributable to Council's endorsement and support of the Township's infrastructure levy adjustment. The transfer to tax-funded infrastructure reserves is inching closer to becoming balanced equally with the amount that's transferred from user pay funds. As noted previously, these transfers are critical to the Township's asset management program, ensuring that we have sustainable funding models moving forward. Lastly, the top-level summary of expenses now includes annual debt financing payments, which are associated with debentures that we issued in late 2022. You can look to reports from our last budget meeting on what those debt payments refer to. But the net impact to the levy after funding DC-related debt is roughly $185,000, which is the equivalent of a 1.86% levy increase. So with all of that information, we get to the bottom line, which is where staff are currently projecting a funding gap of $885,000. As Council is aware, unlike our peers in senior levels of government, municipalities cannot budget for deficits, and as such, this gap will need to be closed through increased property taxes, operating revenue enhancements, or expense reductions to meet a balanced budget for 2023. Following the summary page, staff have provided a detailed budget breakdown for each service area. The top sheet for each service area gives after a lovely photo, which my deputy treasurer added to the presentation for each department. There's a summary of the service level delivery that's currently in place for each department, also highlighting some key pressures and challenges for the coming year. Following this is a detailed budget projection line by line for each service area with supporting notes highlighting some of the cost and revenue drivers. A lot of speaking from me, but my colleagues on corporate leadership team are here alongside CAO Chambers and staff. We are looking forward to gathering feedback from this committee and responding to any inquiries you may have this evening. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Mayor Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Director Kelly. I'm now going to open it up to Council. Councillor Cressman.
So, I guess the normal narrative of any new elected council is, we never thought the books were this bad. I think we've heard that at many levels of government, but when I look at the transfer to Infrastructure Reserve Fund in 2022, it was intended to be $1.587 million, and it ended up being 1.282. So that was basically where we were able to fund the negative bottom line, a portion of the negative bottom line. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Salonen, not quite. The bottom line deficit was not funded through our infrastructure reserve funds or a reduction in those. It was funded through a separate working funds reserve. Why you're seeing that shortfall in what we transferred to infrastructure reserves has to do specifically with a deficit in the operations of the building services area for the year that was more significant than anticipated. Again, this is the compounded effect of slower growth within the municipality. There's still costs to provide services to the building community. In the absence of permit fees at the level of what we were anticipating, the deficit for the year was larger. That's why you see us not hitting the total transfer. The transfer to infrastructure reserve funds for levy-funded ones were exactly what we had projected them to be. We collect a dedicated tax levy for that, and we have to transfer those into reserves. That's in there. In addition, the transfer to user pay reserve funds for water and sanitary is what makes up your $1.28 million from last year.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up at all, Councillor Cressman? No? Okay. Councillor Dunstall.
Through you, Mayor. I noticed, and I may have the date wrong, but I believe in 2019 is when we started with the 2.8 to help build infrastructure. But from 2019 to 2022, the infrastructure reserves went down 4%. So keeping in mind that the goal was always to be debt-free, but that we've put in this 2.8 to build up the reserves, but we're still doing the same thing we were doing before, what would be the strategy to make sure that that 2.8 is actually being used for reserves and not being used to clear off debt?
Sure, great question. Councillor Dunstall, through you, Mayor Salonen, you're correct. The dedicated infrastructure levy was introduced in 2019. It was introduced as a long-term approach to rebuilding our reserve funds. The challenge is in the first couple years of building it up, we're not putting in the amount that we're drawing out to fund capital initiatives that are on the go. Each year, that transfer to infrastructure reserve funds is compounding and growing to a larger number. It's in line with our asset management practice. Asset management programs across the province of Ontario are built upon a very long-term approach to getting municipalities in a sustainable funding setup. So by long-term, I mean 50 to 100 years, not a 10-year cycle. This council now and the previous council have committed to our asset management practice in Wilmot and the need for slow incremental increases to that transfer to infrastructure reserves. We do anticipate in the next 3 to 5 years reaching a point where we're putting more money into the reserves annually than we're drawing out, and we'll start to shift that balance from what we've seen previously.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up, Councillor Dunstall? Okay. Councillor Wilkinson.
Just as a follow-up on that, I'm just curious, I know we talked about the per capita number being the lowest in the region. When did our peers or other municipalities start collecting this reserve fund? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, I mean, do you have an anticipated number in mind, or what are your thoughts in the next 5 years that you'd like to see this number grow by? Sure.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Through you, Mayor Salonen. Our asset management program was built based on the need for that to be a 2.8% adjustment annually for the foreseeable future. I don't want to tell you the year that that's predicted to stop. To your question on when was it introduced in other municipalities, I can not speak for all of them. I do know specifically the Township of Woolwich, which is a close neighbor of ours. They introduced theirs in the mid-2010s, I want to say 2015, 2016. So you'll see, and you'll be able to see online through their budget packages, that number's a lot higher already because of when they started. We were a little later bringing it in Wilmot Township, but it's grown significantly over that time period and continues to compound each year that you provide those incremental increases. It spreads it over your entire tax base, so it's not a big hit in 1 year, but it's effective to kind of put it in incrementally, and 2.8% is what we're at right now, and I would see us presenting that for probably this entire term of council at least, if not further.
Follow-up at all, Councillor Wilkinson? Nope? Okay. Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Mayor Salonen. Through you, Mayor Salonen, I guess this goes to you, Director Kelly. I'm curious, I know I had first noticed in the BMA study that Wilmot Township was listed in the population of 30 to 50,000, and I understand that that's a mistake, and apparently it's a mistake in the early stages of that study, but in fact they did not put us in that higher population rate. Although it does seem strange that in other ministries in provincially we're listed in a different realm with regards to agriculture. So then it makes me wonder, you know, are people looking at us differently than we really are? Another part of what I'm thinking about, and I realize as a councillor with an S, I'm a councillor with an S as well as a councillor with a C, I try not to blame the past. I mean, I know our parents have an effect on us, but my parents were good people and I can't blame them for what I'm doing now. But I'm still trying to understand when I look at that BMA study, Wilmot is at the lowest for the tax discretionary, let me get the name properly, tax discretionary reserves as a percentage of the source revenues, where we're at the lowest, and then also the tax discretionary reserves where we're at the lower end, we're at 27% compared to the median being 82% or the average being 87%. And so I'm just curious, what was the rationale, and maybe the other directors are also part of this decision making, but what was the rationale for Wilmot to be at the lowest end? Why is it that we decided in the past to make those decisions that put us in the place that we're at now?
Sure. Great question, Councillor with an S and Councillor not with an S, Martin. I do appreciate your comments and take them seriously, that we do not want to blame our issues on the past. We have an opportunity to correct the path forward, and I think that's what these conversations are about. As far as I guess there's not a specific policy that was ever put in place that said the Township of Wilmot will have the lowest levy increases, or the Township of Wilmot will utilize reserve funds in order to avoid debt. However, the practice of previous councils and previous administration within this area has been to limit our reliance upon debt, to use our own funding almost with a quote-unquote live within our means practice, or that seemed to be what I've experienced here, and there's colleagues here that have been here for quite a while as well that would probably think similarly. That approach and method did work for a while, and it works definitely when you're in a municipality that has high growth, high assessment growth. When you're in the early to mid 2000s and getting, 5 to 7% assessment growth annually. If we had 5 to 7% assessment growth this year, that's $500,000 to $700,000 in additional tax funding. That makes this budget a lot easier to balance. We're not in that environment.
Would it be okay if I comment on
Sure.
that through you, the Mayor? And I guess Bill 23 in part might affect that. Is that true? That because of the change in development charges, we can't rely on some of the things that we might have tried to rely on in the past?
I might get my colleague to jump in on the Bill 23 piece. DCs are kind of outside of it. It's more, DCs are more utilized for funding our capital program, not so much on the operating side. Having said that, anything that is getting houses built faster in theory would bring the assessment in quicker. It's the mechanism of getting there that I believe we've commented through other reports on, but maybe I'll pass that over to my colleague Okrafka.
Through you, Mayor Salonen. Certainly, there are going to be a lot of development applications coming to this council, in regular council. That will drive growth that's coming forward. The applications are filed. We've had public meetings on some of them. There will be some coming up as soon as the March meeting of council. Ultimately, Director Kelly is correct that if we go back to the days of high growth, certainly that will generate the funds to make these decisions easier. I guess the issue for council to decide will be, what will your response be to that? Will you take growth and say, well, we've got growth now, so we're going to have 0% tax increases again, like we used to? Again, that's the historic problem. With growth, historically, I think again, I was not a member of council, but certainly sat here. I think the intent was the benefits of growth to the community were low taxes and the ability to have very small, if any, tax increases, which to the general public was a benefit of accepting the growth. When that growth slowed down, as it has for a number of years, while we get the infrastructure in place to accommodate the next round of growth, ultimately it's going to be a question for you in this term of council as to what you do when those revenues start increasing again, what your approach will be. Will you maintain those old practices, or will you say, you know what, that's not sustainable over the long term when growth cycles down again, and set the stage for probably a better fiscal future by withholding from the urge to give 0% tax increases because we have building permits coming in and new taxation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but try to give a bit of the flavor of the history of the discussion.
Go ahead. Thank you. Through you, Mayor. I think it really is about having a longer-term view of our future as well. And, having worked in municipal governments for multiple decades now, we used to take a shorter-term approach to things. And I think it's really important to understand that we have to be looking to our future and planning for it. And that's why you're seeing us, doing more in terms of long-term asset management planning. When you're looking at it on a 1 or 2 year approach, it may look great on its surface to come in at a low tax increase and not take on debt. But if what you're doing to balance the budget is pushing costs further down the road, deferring projects, depleting your reserves, you create a bottleneck. And now we're in a position where we're planning for growth. We need infrastructure in the ground. We've got a bottleneck of projects at a time when interest rates are high and project costs are double in a post-COVID world. And that is creating a lot of pressure. So again, it really is taking a strategic approach to where we need to spend. And that's why I said to council in my opening remarks, we may not need to dig into service levels and make some difficult decisions while we're in this period where we're preparing for growth and we need to focus resources there. How do we look at where we're spending our money and prioritize it until we can actually start realizing some revenue from the growth?
Councillor Cressman?
So I was looking at this bar graph on assessment over the last, I think, 2014 onwards in the document 2023-11, and I think it's on page 6 of 11. And I look at it and say, what is the normalized assessment growth? You know, I think if I was looking at that bar graph and it was corn yield or soybean yield, I'd be saying, average would be somewhere in that 1.25 range as being the long-term average from 2014 onwards. And expecting anything different than that would be expecting something that is improbable. So I'm trying to figure out this, positioning ourselves for growth, how quickly it happens, and what's our expectations of what that assessment growth will be.
Okay, through you, Mayor Salen, I'll start that one and probably be leaning on Director Okrafka again. Assessment growth is driven by development activity, and not just residential development, but commercial and industrial development as well. So the longer term, I guess, to your question on what's our longer term target on that, it's completely dependent upon what this council has for a longer term target on how much growth we're going to bring into the Township of Wilmot, the types of growth that we're going to see. To the original point on assessment growth and the use of it and the reliance upon it, and you'll see this in the upcoming debt management and reserve fund strategy. There's a lot of municipalities across this province that do not use assessment growth as something that they rely upon to fund annual operations. Assessment growth is treated in a lot of areas as what I'll call a quote-unquote bonus. Those funds are committed directly into reserve funds for future needs, and they're not an expected revenue source. So that's something for council to consider when we do go forward. To Director Okrafka's point, a historical reliance upon assessment growth to balance our operations has put us in a quite a predicament in years when we don't have the assessment growth. So to say there's an official target for what we're anticipating for assessment growth, I couldn't be able to speak to that. I would say it's definitely going to fluctuate significantly in years when fast growth is coming on, which we're going to see. Again, that assessment growth, though, is dependent upon the timing of when we receive the assessment growth. MPAC kind of controls or holds the reins on that. They've done a great job of hitting standards now of getting the assessment growth to us quicker. But again, just for council's consideration, a heavy reliance on that assessment growth may not be the solution to the problem here, and may want to be considered as additional funds over and above what are required. But I'm not sure as far as timing and assessment growth, if you have any other comments, Director Okrafka.
Through you, Mayor Salen, I don't really have much to add other than, population growth-wise, 2% is sort of universally the target. In the early 2000s, Wilmot was the second fastest mid-sized municipality in Ontario after Wasaga Beach for growth. We were booming. We built a rec complex. You may have heard that there was no debt from that. But again, going to Director Kelly's point of view, that's because we used the assessment growth to pay our share of it. Was that correct? At the time, it worked. Everybody seemed happy with it, but again, now we're getting into periods of low growth, and the taxes aren't there to sustain those operating. So as Councillor Kelly suggested, this council will have to make that decision as to what the sustainable future is. On that, employment is the other key piece that Wilmot historically has had a very low ratio of employment lands to residential assessment. Residential assessment, as Director Kelly probably has said in the report, drives demand for services. Generally, employment development generates a lot of taxes and jobs, but not a huge demand for social services, things like arenas and swimming pools and libraries and the like. So that weighting of assessment is important too. Certainly employment lands are coming on stream, bulldozers are pushing dirt, and that's, between infrastructure services and development services, our goal in economic development is certainly to advance those lands as soon as possible to see job creation, but also assessment growth for the community that really it's been a long time since we've had any significant employment growth. So hopefully that's a light at the end of the tunnel that's positive for the community. But I don't know if that answers your question, but there is no specific right answer other than a greater balance between residential and employment lands and a reasonable rate of growth that the municipality can accommodate. Bill 23 certainly is trying to get municipalities to just open the floodgates and remove basically a lot of planning controls, just build it, and hope that the outcome is good. Wilmot's never really opened the floodgates. We've had growth before that was significant, but quite frankly, developments like the one behind the castle here were controversial when they came on stream, but I think overall it was managed in a way that it didn't overwhelm the community and its ability to service with those softer services like recreation and social services.
Just if I can add on the last point, that assessment mix is a very key point that Director Okrafka raised. I did, and this is the first time we've done this in a report, give a link directly to the BMA study. We rely on that study for a lot of our information. If committee would like me to follow up afterwards with the exact page numbers, there's a comparison of that assessment mix in municipalities across the entire province that participate in this study. And as Director Okrafka noted, Wilmot's relatively low when it comes to the portion of our assessment that's commercial industrial. When that number's low, the residential assessment is picking up the vast majority of taxes in Wilmot Township. So definitely some information to look into within that study.
Councillor Cressman, and then we'll go to Councillor Martin after.
So just to follow up to that, I'm just trying to work my way through you, Mayor, what drives, other than a tax increase, what other levers do we have to make up that gap? Is it number of new homes, priority to business, a combination thereof? I guess I'm just trying to figure out the formula to position this municipality for success into the future.
I'll start, and I think maybe the team may want to jump in on that. But I think certainly focusing on business growth, commercial and industrial growth. We know we're going to attract residential growth, but along with residential growth comes increased demand for services, and many of those services are not full cost recovery. So you see more demand for recreation programs and things like that. So I think it's very important for us to focus on economic development and business growth.
I would just tag on to that. We did talk in the first budget meeting, and this committee approved it. Our fees and charges bylaw updates. Staff noted many times during that outline of that report within the report, alternate revenue streams are one of the main ways that you get away from levy increases. So when we do bring forward them, it's not as people will call them in the press, a cash grab. It's realistically looking at where else can we secure funding, sustainable funding, that will limit our reliance on future levy increases, and alternate revenue streams through new user fees, appropriate user fees being implemented are one way to tackle that. And I think we brought forward again this year a number of reasonable ones that make sense in several areas. So that on top of the economic development is another one, but maybe I'll hand it over to Director Jackson to jump in.
Thank you, through the chair. Just to add on to Director Kelly's comments, we recently brought forward the affiliation policy that this council supported. There is a historical, I know we're using that word historical a lot tonight, I apologize, but a lot of free use of facilities in parks and recreation services, not just community centers, but also office spaces and things like that have never been tackled in the past. So there are some opportunities that can be explored. It's fee for service. You get a space you pay for the space, and it's been a really, I'd love for all recreation to be free. That would be the greatest thing on earth, but it's not realistic, and it's not practical when we have such high expenses to operate our facilities. So I do think there's some opportunities that can be explored to increase revenues.
All right, we'll go over to Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Mayor Salonen. Through you, Mayor Salonen, I've been thinking, Councillor Cressman, about a statement you made in a previous meeting about robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I realize that comes from the Judeo-Christian context. And Councillor Sidhu, I'm curious if there's in a Sikh tradition a statement that might be similar, but it's essentially taking from one good person and using it to give to another good person. And as I'm understanding it, looking back, I realize, Director Jackson, you're saying maybe historical, we're talking about it too much, I'm not sure, but at the same time, as a councillor with an S, I can't forget about our history, and so I think maybe, is that the problem? Is the problem that we've been using growth to pay for services that in other municipalities, they're relying on the levy to pay for services that we're not relying on? Is that why we're in the situation that we're in? Because we seem to be in a quandary. How do we manage in terms of moving forward? Do we cut services, or do we increase taxes? And I realize one of our neighbors has increased quite a significant, it's over 10%. Are we going to consider something like that, or are we going to find a different way? I'm just trying to figure this out in terms of how did we get here and where do we go from here? So maybe it's not a specific enough question, but I'm putting it out there for...
Through you, Mayor Salonen, there was one point that I gravitated to when you brought it up, so thanks for opening up that conversation. You spoke about the municipality close to us and the percentage. My report at length speaks to the reliance upon percentages historically, and it will continue. I've asked CAO Chambers if there's a way for us to stop talking about percentages, but it will never stop. It's important to understand the percentage levy increase versus the actual number of dollars raised by a levy increase. I do speak in the report about municipalities that are similar size to Wilmot or even smaller than Wilmot that have an existing levy of $20 million and what a 5% increase would do versus Wilmot's levy of $10 million and what a 5% increase would do. So not to stick up for our peers next door, but a percentage increase on what the levy was in that small municipality doesn't generate the dollars that it would in a municipality with a larger base levy. And that's important for Wilmot, our residents in this committee, to understand as well. The percentage number is the obvious number to point to, and it's a way to measure what the impact is. But what we like to focus on again is that average impact on $100,000 of assessment, or that monthly impact on the average taxpayer, the actual dollar, the dollar piece. So that gave me the opportunity to speak to that. But to your original point, I think it's fair to say, but a lot of us have been here throughout the term of the practice, and this is what we've had with councils previously and with the way this municipality has operated. And I take pride in what we've done to this point to get the municipality to where it is, but also I'm open to these conversations of discussing how we change course, how we do that. But I know CAO Chambers got in here just shortly before you fine folks showed up on the scene and probably has some insight into that as well.
Yes, and we've talked a lot about this as a staff team, how we can bring forward these issues to council, and I think there's been a hesitancy to be open and real about our fiscal situation here. You talk about how did we get here, what was behind the decision-making of past councils. And what I will say is decisions are only as good as the information that you have before you. And so we're committed as staff to, opening up the discussion and being real about what our issues are. How we got here is not important. How we move forward is important. And so, we are very open to looking at solutions, digging in, providing analysis so that we can move ourselves into a better situation as we prepare to grow. And, you know, you are the council that is going to be taking this on. So, Councillor with an S, you may need to provide some counseling services to the rest of us as we find our way out of this.
I just want to actually also add a little bit onto your question about what we do. And I mean, looking historically, certainly part of the reason I wanted to run was because I love our township, and I will attribute that to how it's been run. I do agree with some of the sentiment that's been shared, and I wasn't quite expecting the books to be like this, but I think it's a great opportunity for us to get to work with everyone around the table here on how we move forward and starting to look at how we plan for the future in more bigger picture and longer term. So I think it's actually opening up a really great opportunity for us, although this budget might be a bit painful, but to be honest, it's being painful everywhere for various reasons. One thing that I would love to bring to the table and see council possibly also align with would be focusing on the economic development side of things. We've heard the benefits from staff on bringing in and attracting economic development as well as retention. And I think also too, part of it is with affordability, being able to provide a diverse range of good paying jobs for our residents as well that are locally based. So that's something that I think as council, should you all also concur, we can have staff explore how we can promote that more and look to that avenue for tax benefits as well and for long-term health of our community. That's just what I wanted to add since you opened up the conversation on it, Councillor Martin, but I didn't know. Did you have a follow-up onto what anyone said? Okay, then Councillor Cressman.
Yeah, I did look in the BMA study to find out what the Kincardine taxes were, and I'll just leave it at that. But I thought,
Through you, Mayor, don't blame me for that, Councillor Cressman.
The background of that one. So two things here. The the gravel license fee or whatever per ton. When is that? Is that within our purview to set? And I know I heard somebody talk about from the gravel industry saying, well, ask us to pay more per ton. People want tax. Very rarely you have people within the industry asking for higher taxes, but I'm just wondering, you know, given the amount of gravel that moves out of our township, that seems to be a pretty paltry sum that we generate from that.
So through you, Mayor Salonen, to Councillor Cressman. So that rate per ton, per tone is set by TOARC, so the Ontario Aggregate something industry of some sort. Sorry for ad-libbing, but it is set by an external party. In my time here back in the mid to late 2010s, so I want to say between 2017 and 2018, it was doubled. It used to be 6 cents per ton, and it changed to 12 cents per ton in an effort to have the gravel industry contributing their fair share towards operating expenses that we have maintaining roads in municipalities where gravel is moving. So that is set by them. The amount that we receive is based on the actual amount of aggregate extracted within our borders in the preceding year. So that's how that calculation is made.
Well, I will take the opportunity to ask, I think, another question on user pay services as it relates to sewage and water. I certainly represent a ward that a good portion of the residents either have their own septic, which they have to pay to maintain, in a lot of cases have their own well. Do we have a very strong firewall between the two? I understand it was in the narrative about if services are provided by levy, the levy-based services that the user pay reimburses them, which I think is a good practice. Is that in a balance that is enforced fairly strongly, or is there a blending of costs that could be done better?
Sure. I'll tackle that one through you, Mayor Sallin. I believe that what you're speaking to is essentially the transfer between our user pay divisions and the levy. Water and sanitary is a prime example of that. So the water and sanitary utility as a whole relies on levy-funded services, one being from the corporate services area. All the billing and collection happens through a levy-funded department, so there's a transfer according to that. A number of the costs related to SCADA system, et cetera, those are funded through our IT area, which is levy-funded, and there's cost sharing on that. I did speak in my lengthy opening remarks regarding that exact line within the overall high-level budget. It was established, the formula for how we share those costs between user pay divisions and the levy about 5 years ago, or in 2019 it was. We feel it warrants the need to review that and update it into 2024. You do not want to get to a point where you're relying on your user pay area more than what you should just to keep your levy costs low. That's why we feel it's a good time, especially with the new term of council, to review that formula and justify. We feel we know that costs are justified right now that we're sharing between user pay and levy, but to reinforce that and update it is part of our work for this year.
One quick thing before we go to you, Councillor Dunstall. I just wanted to catch up on the aggregate question. So I do recognize that there is a separately set by an external industry. Do councils have the purview to put on a different tariff almost or something towards aggregate? Just a question. I don't know the viability of that.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, and I don't feel any staff here would have the answer to that on the spot, but we can look into it, and get back to council on it.
Great, thank you. Councillor Dunstall.
Through you, Mayor, and I agree 100% with the equity development piece. I noticed in there that for Bill 23, some of the planning was being downloaded to the municipalities. Not being a huge fan of the 56% that we already pay to the region, and seeing that some of our services have certainly dwindled. I've seen more police around lately, but that's been dwindling over the last 4 or 5 years. As we're taking on more responsibility that used to be part of the region that's now coming down to the municipalities, is there any way to get that 56% reduced? And if not, or if, regardless, is there a list of everything that 56% represents that we are paying for? Because I don't believe we're being fully represented at the table for any of the townships, and I'd like to see what that 56% is for.
Sure, I can start with that one. So first, the 56% you're referring to is the portion of a Township of Wilmot residential property taxpayers bill that goes to the region of Waterloo, just to be clear. As far as a breakdown of services provided for that 56%, I would look to my your colleague and Mayor Sallinen, who's the representative at the region of Waterloo, who's been in extensive discussions, I believe last week, over 24 hours of meetings within 2 days about regional budgets. So a deep understanding. We monitor at our level as well and can provide insight into what's all included. A key piece for Wilmot Township, aside from the general levy, is we do pay special area rates for the transit levy for bus service out to here, as well as special area rates for library services. That's kind of the distinguishing factor that the townships have outside of what the cities have. I will tell you the cities' transit levies are definitely at a different level than what we pay in Wilmot Township. As far as legislation and bringing that number down, I think the focus more so has been lobbying or speaking with the province, who did make iterations, Minister Clark, that the decisions they're making at the provincial level that create what I refer to from the West Wing as an unfunded mandate comes forward from the province. They do speak to that and mention that they want to find a way to make it revenue neutral for municipalities to ensure that the new costs that we're taking on by taking over responsibilities, we will be made whole, is the words they're using. So we're looking to the province for that more so than the region of Waterloo or upper tier government. But to the other aspect of your 56% or the taxpayers' 56%, we can provide greater detail of what's in the regional budget through the mayor.
Through you, Mayor. So in relation to your question about Bill 23 and Bill 39, the downloading of planning responsibilities, we're awaiting regulations, we're awaiting the appointment of the provincial facilitator, and so we don't really know the timing or how that's all going to transpire, and we're sort of in a wait-and-see mode. The provincial facilitator is going to be looking at delivery of services between the region and the lower tiers. We anticipate they would be focusing immediately on growth-related services because it really is about building more homes. So we really don't know what the impact of that is going to be. If there are going to be additional service shifts between the region and the lower tier, we would expect to see a shift of the levy between the region and the lower tier. But it's something that we're certainly going to have to keep an eye on as this evolves. So at this point, it's really just unknown, but that would be the expectation.
Thank you.
So to provide more answers on the regional side of things, so happy you asked. Yeah, so regional budget day is on the 22nd. I would really encourage if anyone, including those watching, have time to tune in, but also if you have any other things that you'd like me to advocate for, please let me know. It's proving to be a really difficult budget at the region, and I'll be really frank, council so far around the Horseshoe has only added additional requests to the budget, so it's going to be a very interesting and, I imagine, long day. I know personally I'm going to be advocating for some things to be removed and service levels to be changed. Having said that, I don't know the feeling of the 15 other people that are my colleagues that sit around the Horseshoe, but it really has been an eye-opening and interesting conversation that we've been having. I would, Director Kelly did also point out the area rating. That's important to know because I was certainly alarmed at some of the proposals regarding transit things, at what that means for our municipality. However, we are only paying for our bus 77 that comes out. We are not paying for the LRT out of our tax levy. We are not paying for the other general bus services that don't come out here. So that's something to keep in mind that also adds odd complexity to the budget when you're looking at it outwardly. I know it took me a while to wrap my head around. So I would encourage you guys to look at that. In terms of a breakdown for every tax dollar that we send off to the region where that goes, I have spoken to the CAO about seeing if we can get something like that. I don't know realistically how easy that's going to be, but that is something I'm continuing to advocate for because I think it would really help people understand how their taxes work. And even just when we send out the property tax bills to collect taxes on behalf of ourselves, the region, and the school board, it makes it a lot easier for us to explain to our residents if we can better describe where all of that goes. So I'm working on that, but also I am really appreciating all of the comments that I'm getting from residents regarding regional issues. So on that, I'll just use it as a plug. Do reach out to me if you have questions or if you want to see things or comments, and I'm more than happy to bring them to the table. Does anybody? Okay, Councillor Wilkinson.
All right, through you, Mayor. Not necessarily a question, but more so just a general thought and commentary, and hate to be the one to bring it up, but I think ultimately what we're staring at right now is a budget that is telling us that we need to look at cutting spending in services and review our operating divisions and find ways to collect and earn more revenue through user-funded services or fees for service, whatever it happens to be. And I think in general, the market conditions are telling us that this is the time to be doing it. We see interest rates and we see just the general way the economy is responding right now. This is the opportunity to, I hate to use the the term austerity, but look at what can we do to cut back and get us back to a healthy position. We can do that while we wait for the growth, which we know eventually will help bring us back to a healthier position. But we need to look at this, and we need to focus right now on getting to that healthy position. But it needs to be incremental. It can't just be a very quick fix and a reaction that is going to upset a lot of long-standing residents, and I think we need to be respectful of that and balance it. So I appreciate the ask that is being put forward here, but also looking at this as an opportunity to say, perhaps we need to do the hard work and look at the areas we're spending money and say maybe we have been living beyond our means, and look at our past mistakes and make the right choices now to move forward, but step by step.
If you don't mind, through you, Mayor, that I respond to that. I think that's fair, and that's something that we as staff certainly anticipated coming forward with this budget, that council was going to want to dig in and look at service areas. I go back to the fact that October elections, right before budgets, are very challenging, right? Because to really dig in and do a proper analysis and looking at service levels, that should be done in consultation with the community. That should be done through comprehensive engagement with the community. And we just don't have the ability or time to do that for this budget. So I anticipate that we will likely employ some of the same historical tactics in cutting the budget this year that we have in the past, with a commitment to do better in the future. And so I would expect we would take on a significant amount of citizen engagement in 2023, develop those priorities for council and really be laser focused in where we're allocating resources in future.
Thank you. Councillor Sadhu.
So as we're gathering more information, understanding we all are new, as we get more information, I'm looking to get a report that would, as I'm seeing here, staffing is a large chunk of the budget. Is there any way we can get a report that gives us the new staffing levels over the last 5 years up until now, so we can kind of do more due diligence and just see where the resources have been being spent over the last 5 years?
Yes, that is a significant portion of our budget. We are a service industry, and so staffing is a big piece of that. Knowing that council doesn't have the historical context of the new positions that have been added over time, we're happy to do an analysis and present that to you. Not all positions are fully funded by the levy. Some are funded by user fees or offset by user fees. Some are offset by revenues in development. So I think it would be a benefit to you to see what that mix and breakdown is. We also discussed the organizational review, so looking at the human resources requirements, for the next number of years as we respond to growth. We're really providing a plan for that. So I think that could be brought forward in conjunction with the report on the organizational review, so that you have some context there, if that would be appropriate for council. I would anticipate that we're not going to look at those levels of service until sort of the end of the budget process, when we understand where we're at with both operating and capital, so that you can consider that. And again, we discussed other priorities that council may have tonight around economic development, so I think it'll give you some context in how you want to allocate resources for the coming year.
Great. Councillor Dunstall.
Through you, Mayor. The asset management piece that you guys are putting together to mitigate expenses as we move forward, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're working on that now. And so when would that be? When do you think you see that coming to fruition?
Through you, Mayor Salonen, and I know our asset management coordinator is going to be watching from home and is going to love this response, that never is over. Asset management planning is a forever part of municipal government now. We are required via legislation to bring annual updates to council on the status of our asset management program. We've seen, I guess, since we've instituted, put resources towards asset management planning and funding towards it. We've seen that with every additional piece of data and information that we get into our asset management plan, the outcomes and the ability to rely on that plan to make decisions going forward that are evidence-based decisions and balance risk and life cycle costs and everything continues to improve. I will say that there's never an end date for asset management planning, but it will always get better. It will always get more accurate. The second you see the data in our asset management plan, it's already outdated. We'll get more. So I guess if your question is when will council or this committee see the impacts of asset management planning, I think you're going to see it every year when we update the 10-year capital forecast. I think you're going to see it every year when we bring forward a request for what the dedicated infrastructure levy needs to be to make a sustainable capital program. So long answer to say there's never a final date on it. We're going to keep doing it.
Okay, thank you. I was really looking at the piece for the fleet management because that seems to be something that's just coming on board, which is great with all the expenses. So that's really the piece I was looking at.
Sure, yeah. So the specific component for our fleet management and fleet replacement strategy is well in along the road to being ready to be presented to council. We'd like to get the budget process put away prior to bringing forward that fleet replacement strategy. It will have an impact on the longer term budget for the municipality. I don't think it'll impact much of the current year. The majority of our purchases with regards to fleet have already been approved or are already within the docket to go forward. But I would anticipate we're looking at the second quarter of this year, contingent upon when we wrap up the budget process, we'd bring that forward to council.
Great. Councillor Cressman.
Yes, I guess going back to consultation as being important, I would affirm that communication is important because it was an eye-opener to me to look at community services and see how much we are subsidizing that income versus expenses. And don't get me wrong, I could come up with another Judeo-Christian comment about idle hands or the devil's playground, but we won't go there. But I think it's important that we keep our youth active and busy and engaged and seniors and all that. But I think we have to communicate what it's costing so that they can manage their expectations. So I think that's the piece that I would say that we have to say this is likely. If you look at revenue versus expenses, one of the most expensive things we do as a township. And if you have other suggestions, I'm open to them, but I think communicating that is very important.
So through you, Mayor Salonen, I might hand it over to Director Jackson afterwards, but you raise a good point. The numbers are there, but describing what the numbers mean is an important part in communicating it. I think tonight's a fantastic example of us being able to get this information out to the public. You're right that community services, recreation programming, facilities is definitely a subsidized area of municipal government, lower tier municipal government. I would frankly say if we charged the fees to make it cost recovery for swimming and ice times, we'd have an empty pool and an empty ice rink. Having said that, the numbers that are in front of you show that in the budget that we have before you, approximately 36% of all rec fees are recovered, rec costs are recovered through user fees. The remaining 64% is subsidized by the levy. Those are types of multiples that council and this committee can look at and say, do we think that's reasonable? Do we think that the levy should fund 64% of all of our parks and rec costs, or do we think that number should be adjusted? To adjust it means user fees and obviously reviews of expenditures as well, but maybe I'll pass that over. That's my finance level comments, but over to Director Jackson.
Thank you, Director Kelly. Through you, Mayor Salonen. It is a really good question, and I don't have the statistics for the rest of the region as to what the percentage of subsidy is. I can say that the Wilmot Recreation Complex does very well, in my opinion, for cost recovery, it's about 60%. That is a really good number from my historic experience. It may not be a great number, but I think it's a reasonable number for that, that facility being our key recreation facility. But we can't cost recover on open space, on trails, on all of the other services that, you know, that are out there in the community. Community centers are another challenging one. Definitely putting Director Kelly's hat on, which I don't wear that finance hat whenever unless I absolutely have to. There is certainly an opportunity for council to establish cost recovery targets. And that's something that could be considered. It would take time. As I think it was Councillor Wilkinson said, we don't want to upset all of the residents and say all of a sudden all of their rates are going up. We don't want to have empty pools. We learned through COVID how critically important, I don't like the word soft service, no respect there, Director Okrafka, but recreation is critically important in the community, and when it was taken away, it was really, really drastic for the community and for every community, not just Wilmot. But it is important also to be fiscally responsible. So it helps staff if we have targets, because then we can bring budget numbers back to say, these are the costs that need to be recovered. These are the free uses that need to be reconsidered. And we can take a look at some of that and try to bring back numbers that are acceptable to members of council and still serve the community.
Just as a follow-up, don't get me wrong. I mean, I had 4 sons that all played hockey and fastball and provided by facilities in this township. And I think it's important in their development in terms of the team is more important than the individual. I think it was key to that. And so I think we have to keep it in the mindset of our ratepayers that this costs money to do, and we're subsidizing it, and as such, it manages their expectations of what additional services we can provide.
And just to add on to that as well, I think too, keeping in mind, I think we've all agreed that the budget's not going to be exactly what we want right now, and it is going to be a slower process, but going forward it's going to become something that with more community involvement as well and further discussions like this that we can all be happy with. But with that, also keeping in mind after this budget process, we're going to be headed into strategic planning, and that's where we can really hone in on some of that community engagement and discussing service levels, setting expectations, and figuring out what as a community we really envision going forward, and that's just going to help us continuing on into further budgets as this process, I don't think, really ever ends. I believe you guys start budget as soon as this one finishes.
Yeah, we're already in the midst of budget 2024, just so you know.
Great. But Councillor Dunstall, please.
Through you, Mayor. One of the things I had noticed, and I actually, when I sent an email to Director Kelly, I was hoping he would tell me that my decimal was wrong, and I noticed that it was 890% underfunded for the community services. What I did want to say, though, is I appreciate what was said here about how important it is for our youth and for our seniors. Having 42% over 55 is a big deal, but also to attract families. I know a lot of young families who, when they're looking to relocate or they're looking to purchase, are looking for the types of services that we offer. So kudos to that.
Through you, Mayor Salonen, and I appreciate Councillor Dunstall, your comments, and adding to that, the discussion has been brought up regarding the buses at 77. I want to say I'm very much in support of bus 77. I think it's wonderful that we have a bus coming out to Wilmot. I'd personally like to see more of that, because environmentally, if we're asking people to drive their personal vehicles less, if we're asking people to consider how can we use mass transit more, I think that's important.
And just in general, to give you more background, Councillor Martin, we're also I'm speaking with our fellow rural mayors, and we're advocating to the province to see if we can run a pilot or something to also get more interconnectivity between the townships. I know, for example, Wellesley, I mean, a lot of those kids come to high school from the town of Wellesley, and they don't have a pool, so even looking at if we can get some sort of transit things going there, whether that's through GRT or something else. But it's certainly being discussed, and would welcome if anyone has ideas or inputs as well to be able to bring their voice to the table on that. Any other questions or comments, councillors, that we have on this tonight? Councillor Cressman.
I sometimes worry I have too many questions, but when we look at the importance of economic development and businesses coming and the importance in terms of our budget, what is usually the lag time between, development-ready lands, and I guess it all depends who's coming and buying and putting money down on the table, or in the development cycle, when does the developer actually pay the development charges? When the house is finally sold, or when it's actually the foundation goes in the ground, or when the subdivision plan goes in? Just so I have kind of the mechanics of when the dollars actually hit our purse.
Through you, Mayor Salonen, development charges are payable at the building permit stage, whether it's a house, whether it's a factory. That's the trigger point for those fees to come in. In terms of the lag time, the employment lands is probably a good example. Rough grading's going in now. Servicing, engineering drawings are under review as we speak. We would expect servicing to begin in the spring, hopefully. There's various estimates as to the timeline for servicing to be completed, but I can tell you that Waterloo EDC, for example, our partners in economic development, that you've seen in the budget that we fund to bring clients to Wilmot. We've already met with the developers in terms of exchanging information and what marketing activities can be offered by the municipality and by Waterloo EDC to the developers. So there's already an active exchange of information flow looking towards assisting wherever we can to ensure that those lands not only come on stream, but that buildings are going up as close to where we are right now rather than years from now. So certainly that's the strategy and the effort. It obviously, in terms of staff resources, as you're aware, there are limitations to the resources, but we do certainly jump in as soon as we can to get those permits issued, development charges, and jobs created for the community. So I would expect, hopefully, by the end of the year, optimistically, you could see buildings possibly going up. The lag time, depending on what that building is, and it could be 6-month build, it could be a year build, depending on what the nature of the business is as well. So.
Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Director Krafka, do we have any idea of the types of businesses that are coming in there? And not being familiar with the process, do we have any say in what types of businesses that come in there?
Through you, Mayor Salonen, the zoning is in place for those properties and governs the uses that could come into those properties. So the owners of the property retain the control. They get to decide who they sell to. The municipality, unless we would acquire those lands, don't per se get to decide what is going in there. However, the list of zoning uses does give guidance on what would be permitted, typically employment uses, looking for creation of jobs, not looking for large warehouses with robots and
so we're
5 employees. But we don't actually control the specific business. We can provide opportunities to the developers that we feel are a good match for the community, and certainly our discussions with the developer, they're looking for higher end job heavy uses and not too vast spaces per se with few employees. So I think from a staff perspective it would seem, but in terms of the actual names of businesses or the specific types, we can't provide you with that per se, although I can provide you with the zoning category so that you can see the types of businesses that would be allowed.
And is it commercial and industrial?
It's employment is the term that we use now rather than commercial industrial. It's typically it would be industrial. It would be there could be some service support commercial within it, but typically the focus is on on jobs and employment, not, shopping malls and large retail uses would not be permitted in that development.
Any other questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I want to say thank you very much, staff. I know that us sending back the original budget added some confusion and opened up, actually, I think, a really great opportunity for really good discussion. And thank you, councillors, for some great questions. I know some of you picked up on stuff that I didn't even catch. So just on a positive note, I just think it's gone really well, and I'm looking forward to the continued process with staff and getting the budget to where we want. So now, with no further questions, we are going to call a vote. So I'll just quickly remind everybody that the recommendation is that the Ad Hoc Budget Advisory Committee receive the report COR 2023-11 for information. So just for those of you watching, a reminder again, we are not voting to pass any percentage or pass the budget tonight. It is just that we're receiving what's in the package for information and what we discussed tonight. So all of those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Now I will ask for us to go into adjournment and that we meet again.
Through you, Mayor Salonen.
Sorry, yes.
I know it's not really in the agenda, but I just simply want to thank the staff. I appreciate all of the hard work that you've done, and I know we've tried not to catch anybody off guard. We've tried to think about our questions in advance, but I really appreciate you being here, talking with us, and thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, now if everyone's good, I will call for us to adjourn. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favor? Fantastic, and we are adjourned. Thank you.